they can ask questions during the presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll share my screen then.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, I just threw this presentation together about lessons on sort of building entrepreneurial ecosystems. And I just have some like highlights that I wanted to share. And again, if people have questions, they can. For those who don't know me, I don't know if people have seen this American movie, Forrest Gump. I'm not the smartest person in the world, but I've been around the world working at various donor agencies, different governments, I've led at least 2 major entrepreneurship projects. I've designed a lot of entrepreneurship and ecosystem development projects for different donors out there. I'm currently, for the Germans, for GIZ, I'm actually developing a training on how to strengthen the ecosystem in the countries they operate in. So I've been doing this for about 13, 14 years, and I've done had bad activities and initiatives and good ones. So I know both the good and bad of some of the things that you've done or what can do in these activities. There's a lot of I think focus on entrepreneurship development now. A lot of it is based off of economics. We know that high growth entrepreneur, go ahead. We know that high growth entrepreneurs create jobs. And that's usually a minority of the companies in your population. So those companies, they're ambitious, they create new products, go after new markets. Those are the job creators in any location, typically. And because of this, almost every government in the world, I mean, every country I've visited has some sort of startup or entrepreneurship program. I mean, even the country of Somalia, a fragile state in conflict, even has entrepreneurship programming. So it's something that is happening across the world. And we know from the Startup Genome report that most of the government actions at the national level are focused on 2 things. One is providing some sort of, they're trying to make it easier to ask for access to capital and access to financing. So that is the #1 thing that governments across the world are doing. And the second thing is they're providing support to programs. So a lot of the bigger regulatory and policy initiatives are not quite happening yet within governments, but they want to help entrepreneurs. They want to help finance entrepreneurs, right now. And so you see many government initiatives and activities around this. And part of that is they want to, since they're supporting a lot of these programs and financing, they want to understand the ecosystem, and what is an ecosystem? I mean, that's a question I'm sure, and there's these different mapping tools, and so there's something called the Eisenberg mapping tool, which is down in the corner there, the lower corner, but basically it's sort of the organizations and people that support entrepreneurs. It's the type of culture that you have. It's the financing, it's the regulations, the policy, the talent, all these things. And so you have very complicated maps. Usually a lot of governments and other donors will actually come in and try to map all these things out. Like what is, who are the organizations providing financing? Who's providing training? Who's providing mentoring? And so they design this massive map of trying to figure out, who's supporting what and what are some of the gaps in that. But from my own experience, there's become a problem, especially recently. We're forgetting something. So we have a lot of focus on, accelerators, incubators, co-working spaces, mentoring, angel investors, all these things. And we're all sort of focused on these things, and we're kind of forgetting the entrepreneur. And luckily, because of the training I'm developing right now for the Germans, I've really been able to dig in and talk to some of the top thinkers about ecosystem development and really rethink about what we need to do. I mean, if you think about, if you look at history and you see, for example, Silicon Valley and how it was created, it really wasn't, it wasn't like this strategic thing. It was basically a lot of people in the chip manufacturing and in the computer manufacturing who are meeting serendipitously at bars that wanted to create great companies. And they found common purpose to develop faster, better chips. I personally have looked at the automotive industry in Detroit, Michigan, when the biggest car companies in the world and ultimately the biggest companies in the world came up, and I've actually mapped this out. But what you saw again is people would come together, engineers, manufacturing people, people who understood metalwork, people who understood different types of manufacturing. They would come together, find each other because they had common purpose. And so when people ask me, what is an ecosystem now? It actually is pretty simple. Where can you get people, organizations, define common purpose about supporting entrepreneurs? And so it's not as complicated, I think, as many of those maps are. It's really quite the opposite. It's like where people and organizations and the government are focused is sort of where your ecosystem is. And if you don't have people, if you don't have enough organizations focus in on a specific purpose, it's really difficult to have an ecosystem. So there's a lot of tools and ways you can sort of get people to buy into a vision. But if, for example, the government is just driving something, but it can't get the private sector involved in it, it's really not an ecosystem. You really need all actors focusing on one purpose. And the most successful ecosystems are really driven because there's a lot of actors who feel like we have a common purpose. The reason the Silicon Valley is so successful is that there's so many people in technology and finance who want to create the future and know this is the place to create the future. And so that common purpose brings everyone together. And so, I this is very new for me. And there's a professor at MIT who's coming up with this thinking, and that's why I typically haven't talked about this in the past. But for me, it's super, super important, and I've talked to lots of programs about this. The more organizations, business leaders, government actors, ecosystem organizations, that in finance organizations that are on the same mission, the more successful your ecosystem will be. So this is one of the big learnings I've come out recently, with, because I think personally, I think things have gotten so complicated on looking at those maps and the different types of things that you need in your ecosystem, and you need, literally 60 different, ways to categorize the different things, different categories that you need. It's really, do you have enough organizations and people really even focused in on the same purpose, the same objectives, the same goal? So let me just give you, I said I'd just give you a couple of lessons. I wanted to start with that to kind of understand at least some different perspectives of what an ecosystem is, but some 5 lessons that I think are important, to help sort of your entrepreneurial ecosystem. The first one is it's led and is driven by entrepreneurs themselves. And let me just tell you about a study that Endeavor Insight did, where they compared Nairobi with Bangalore. Nairobi is if you go to Nairobi, almost every donor organization from the World Bank, USAID, the Germans, the British are all funding different entrepreneurship activities and programming in Nairobi. If you go to India and you go to Bangalore, it's all driven by the private sector. And the results are striking. There's a lot more job creation. There's a lot more successful businesses in Bangalore than Nairobi. I mean, the fact of the matter is there's only so much a government and a donor can do. It really needs to be driven by companies in the private sector and the entrepreneurs themselves. I mean, and when the theory around ecosystem development came around, and there's a book called Startup Communities that Brad Field wrote, and he's going to have a second version of his book coming out fairly soon. His first lesson, it needs to be entrepreneur focused, and the data reinforces that thinking. The second part of this is I've really spent a lot of time to look at a lot of the research around ecosystem development, and there's not a lot of science out there. There's a lot of assumptions and hypothesis, but there's not a lot of science. But what we do know, and Zoom knows this for sure, the network is most important. Successful entrepreneurs engaging with new entrepreneurs and new startups. There are a number of sources, reports and analysis and research that reinforce that network is the most important thing, the connections that people make. This is a map of New York and the tech ecosystem, and just how the bigger dots, circles are large IT companies, and the pink lines are connections to smaller companies. And what they see is that these larger companies actually are spinning off and creating all these smaller companies out there. So what we know is that if you're an employee of a successful company, if you're a supplier, if you're a mentor, if you're an investor of these successful companies, you're more likely to be successful yourself in your own company. You're more likely to grow your revenue. You're more likely to be able to raise money. So the network is most important. Third thing I think is, how do you actually help entrepreneurs? And this, I have a hard time getting through to a lot of governments and donors about this. And so let me take you out and talk about something different. I don't know if anybody here is an endurance athlete, a runner, a biker, swimmer, but the thing about endurance athletes is you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. You have to push yourself in training, to really be able to take, to be able to deal with sort of uncomforts in your physical, just running out there. So to be a great runner or biker, there's some specific training. There's some coaches that can tell you about specific things. But the biggest thing is, how can you push yourself to your limits? So there was two brothers who had a retail shop in the United States that sold running equipment, and they wanted to create a hub for great American runners. So what they did is they studied the Kenyans, they studied the Japanese, and what they saw is that what the Kenyans and the Japanese did is they actually had just camps of running camps. Like, all the great runners would live together, they would train together. And what they did is it kept people accountable to themselves. Like, when you're training and you're living with someone, and you're in a very tough workout, and everyone's pushing themselves, you don't want to be the person who's relaxing. There's like a group, there's a culture mentality within the group that you're sort of relying on each other. And so a big part of their program was and what the two brothers did is they basically bought two houses, one for women, one for men. and basically offered these runners free room and board and some expense money for them to basically train for a year together. And this small little running shop created a number of American Olympians just based off the pure pressure and the culture they created within their training regimen. So if we take that methodology and that thinking to entrepreneurship, I think what we can see is this sort of backs up some of the data we've seen. Because we have these organizations, many of them will call them entrepreneurship support organizations, things like accelerators and incubators and university programs. Now, the data tells us that these organizations can help entrepreneurs. There's big variance. A lot of these organizations are not good. A lot of them are great. So there's big variance. But by and large, on average, these organizations, through the data, help entrepreneurs. But it isn't the way we think they help them. You know, I think a lot of people think it's about training. It's about providing some sort of knowledge and expertise, and that, you know, these entrepreneurs need things about marketing, or they need to learn about lean startup. But that's not really the effect that they're doing. What they're doing is they're actually making the entrepreneurs accountable to their companies. And the way that they're doing it is they're creating peer networks or mentor networks. They're connecting entrepreneurs with others, but they're trying to make sure that the entrepreneurs don't have bosses, but they're trying to make sure that there's some accountability to the entrepreneurs, so they're accountable to their company to push the company. They're trying to create a culture around that. And they're trying to use data. So they're trying to compare data between the different, I mean, for the runners, it's clear, it's easy to record the data, but for the programs, they're trying to use data also both as benchmarks against other entrepreneurs and for the entrepreneurs themselves to measure it, you know, over time. So the point I'm trying to get across is if we look at the data, and the data that I'm referring to comes from a report called the Golly Report. I'm sure Zoom knows it very well. It shows that training doesn't have much effect on entrepreneurs or workshops. It's really the networks and the connections, and the peer networks have shown really good results. And the reason I think why is that it keeps the entrepreneurs accountable. It creates a culture of accountability, you know, out there. So again, it goes back to the first point, the first lesson I presented. How do we keep entrepreneurs accountable to themselves? Because it's not that, it's just really hard to do what they're trying to do, especially if you're trying to do something innovative, you're trying to go to new markets, you're trying to develop new products. These things are hard. So it isn't as much about how do you do it, because there's a lot of information on the internet and other places on how to develop a new product. But doing it is hard. And so how do you create a culture and a social circle that keeps them accountable, so they're doing the difficult things that keep their business going and growing? The fourth point I wanted to make is, you know, every time I go to an access to finance workshop, everybody talks about the American model to me. I mean, I was just before COVID happened, I was in Cape Town last December for a venture capital training, and everybody was complaining about the American model. And when people talk about the American model, they mean the Silicon Valley venture capital model, which is not really the American model. It's just one part of what goes on in America. So the data I show in front of you is on I guess my right, the Inc. We have a magazine called Inc. Magazine, and every year it does a survey of the 5,000 fastest growing private companies in America. The biggest, I mean, these are companies that are not public. So companies like Microsoft and Apple at one point were on this list. And when they go public, they're no longer on this list. But these are companies on average that'll be growing 300, 400% per year over a 3-4 year period. So really fast growing companies. And only 6.5% of these companies actually receive venture capital. In America overall, only about 0.5%, so that's 0.5% receive venture capital. There's so much focus and media and attention on venture capital, but even in America, venture capital is not the majority of how companies fund their companies, how founders fund their companies. Sorry. So what we know is that for it to be a really strong ecosystem, it isn't just about venture capital. It's actually about a diverse array of financial products. I mean, I've seen in situations where companies, they need working capital. They need to be able to lease equipment. They need to be able to factor their accounts receivable. They just need short-term loans to buy some inventory for the new project they got. Working cap, I mean, there's a diverse number of products that is needed, out there. And there's over-reliance on a lot of people and focus on venture capital and equity investment. So that's my, a big point. I think the biggest point, the difference between America and other countries is actually because in America, people are using their personal capital to finance their businesses, and there's enough income that people, usually in America, the average person to start a business in America is around 37, 38 years old. So they have some savings and they have some credit, so they can use credit cards to finance their business. And this is how the vast majority of American businesses are financed, is actually their personal credit and their personal savings. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about the governance of the ecosystem. I mean, there's a specific reason why people use the word ecosystem, because in a forest, nobody really controls the growth of a forest. There's just a self-reinforcing nature of the forest that nobody controls, that helps all these different types of animals and plant life to grow. And so a lot of the issues of an ecosystem is around governance that I've seen. And there's a lot going on to sort of make better governance structures out there. Probably the thing that people talk about the most that I've seen is the Tunisia Startup Act, which happened a couple of years ago. Basically, the entrepreneurs in Tunisia felt like they needed more government support and the ecosystem organizations. So they advocated to the government as one unit. So they actually self-organized themselves, found this common purpose that I talked about, and advocated to the government and say, listen, this is the support we need, help us out. And the government actually created this public-private entity that is controlled by the ecosystem of trusted advisors. So there's a committee that currently does it, that provides that support that I talked about in the beginning of supporting the different ecosystem organizations and subsidizing some of the financing. There's a group called I for Policy, which is using technology to hear more voices from a wide variety of organizations and entrepreneurs in Africa on the sort of ecosystem activities that they wish from their governments. But my point is, as I said in the beginning, I go across the world and I sort of talk about some best practices. But the reality is, the best practice is really listening to your entrepreneurs, engaging with them, trying to talk to your different ecosystem organizations, see what their needs are, and creating a dialogue which will help create this common purpose that I talked about. Because there really isn't a lot of data of what really works besides the network and creating collaboration. And there is too much focused in on sort of venture capital financing. And really, I think the the ecosystems that really find more collaboration, create an environment where no one's controlling the ecosystem, where everyone has a voice, where trusted actors and entrepreneurs are really the center of support. These are the ones that are really growing. So with that, I know exactly what you wanted to hear, but this is just some of my current lessons and learnings from some of my work that I've done.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Nam, very difficult to hear you.
So, can you hear me clearly now?
No, I think without the micro, without microphone better.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay, so Mike, I sent you 2 questions, and one is your experience in connecting and coordinating resources. We want to hear about your journey in how you connect with others players in the ecosystem, not like all about what you did, you create a slide and then you present those slides, 5 important findings. It is great, but then we want to hear more about you. More about yourself, how do you build your connection? Like Mr. Dung said, you are great at creating a network of mentors and creating a network of other ecosystem, other players.
Okay, so what I heard is you want to hear. I mean, what I heard is you want to hear some stories of how I help different ecosystems.
Yeah. And then others.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting topic because the ecosystems change so differently over time. And so when I look back at my experiences, I don't think I could do what I did back when I started. So I would say my first real experience is Egypt. So right after the revolution in 2011, I mean, President Obama had an initiative called the Global Entrepreneurship Program. And I was sent to lead that first initiative in Egypt. It was the first country selected there. And at that point, and if you think about the world, there wasn't, most things that were happening were like business plan competitions. There weren't any real accelerators in most countries. Egypt itself had one venture capital firm that barely did any deals because there wasn't deal flow for them. And they just went through a revolution, so their government was literally in flux. I mean, it was 2 years of literally different governments every 3-4 months. So I was sent to basically help build the ecosystem. And what I did is I just found, again, people who had common purpose, who wanted to build an ecosystem. So, and most of them were people who've already been successful entrepreneurs themselves. So, or investors. So, for example, there was a gentleman, his name was Dr. Khalid Ismail. He built and sold his company to Intel. He had a chip design company, and he sold it to Intel. And he wanted to do something. He became an angel investor, and so he would ask us to help create pipeline for him. There was a new accelerator that came online at the same time that we were starting this project. And so we would do marketing events together because they had no pipeline in the beginning. It was, so they had to create their own brand. So we would help them with supporting a lot of the sort of startup events like startup weekends and stuff like that, the Create Pipeline. There was one gentleman who graduated from the London School of Economics. His family owned, was a fairly wealthy real estate family, and he wanted to do some angel investing, and we said, why don't you create an angel group? And so we brought in expertise. So he knew how to create an angel group, and that was called Cairo Angels, and they've been investing for about 8 years now, investing over, I think, $4 million from that perspective. Organizations would come to us and ask us to develop different training programs, mentoring programs. So we would do that. We went out there and we recruited and build the capacity of a lot of mentors. So we went in the private sector. But it was really, and then when the government finally came around, it was the Egyptian government actually was elected. We introduced the government to the ecosystem, and so we helped create collaborations between different programs. For example, there was an NGO that ran an incubator, and we helped create a program where them and a government entity work together to help some startups. So we did a lot of facilitation. We did a lot in the media. We would sponsor some in the morning shows. Like they had a morning show called Good Morning Cairo. We would bring entrepreneurs in. We would prep them on telling their stories. We'd bring mentors in. We'd have mentors and entrepreneurs telling their stories. So we actually brought in, we worked with the media and told them how to tell the entrepreneur story, which is different because there needed to be a mindset change in Egypt. If we looked back at that point, people, like if you surveyed people and they surveyed people through the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor Report in Egypt, they didn't respect entrepreneurs. They didn't want their sons or daughters to be entrepreneurs. And so we did a lot of focus on the media to make entrepreneurship like, it would be okay if your daughter, your son, or their potential spouses to be entrepreneurs. We made it exciting. So, and we actually saw upticks in that for the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor Report. So if I move ahead to today, I think I just saw it's from the Startup Genomics report. It's one of the top ecosystems top growing ecosystems in the world now. And the reason was, again, we found champions and we basically said, how can we help you? We found people who wanted to create accelerators, and we brought in, people from the US and other places who could help them with programming or training programs. So it was really, as an outside force in this country, one of the biggest decisions I personally made was, I don't want to have our own training program. I want to help all these organizations and people who are trying to do their own initiatives right now. And so, that was the big sort of focus for that particular project. Now, if I go back into Egypt, I wouldn't do that exact same thing. I would do something different because there's so much more advanced. Now it's about how can we make more connections with those organizations to North America, to Europe. How can we make those companies more global? How can we help more sophisticated financing products? How can we get outside of Cairo, the capital, and do more in the other parts, especially the third and fourth and fifth biggest cities out there? How can we get more of that type of programming going? But in the beginning, in 2011, these things were not happening yet. And now that we have, our first level of entrepreneurs, and many of those entrepreneurs I worked with are now running $30, $40 million companies, have gotten several rounds of investment, have gotten rounds of investment even from Silicon Valley. Some are angel investing themselves now. Many are mentoring right now. You know, how, you know, so now it's really how do you leverage that and get to a deeper level from that, you know, that perspective. Another project that I had, you know, Zoom helped on was the Tigers Mekong program. And that was 2014, 15 Zoom, or 15, 16?
Until 2016.
Yeah. I mean, and you know, in there, it was a State Department program, and it was a regional program for the Mekong region. And there it was like, how can we leverage both Thailand and Vietnam to bring up Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia, and create those cross-border connections? Because again, the network, I mean, the data shows us that when I talk about the network, it isn't just the internal network of a city, it's the international connections a city could have with multiple countries, you know, out there. And so there it was really bringing in some of the programs from Vietnam, Thailand, having these big regional events, making connections, you know, bringing people together. I think we did a lot on the financing, because once we had one group in Vietnam going, other countries seemed to want to go as far as the angel investing was going. So we were able to leverage, I guess, the country proximity to people share lessons and also motivate to do what others are doing, you know. And I think there was a couple regional initiatives around women entrepreneurship and angel investing that came out of that. When me and Zoom designed the Swiss EP program in Vietnam, again, Vietnam didn't have any programming back in 2015, right, Zoom? About 2015. So we had to think about how can we design a program that will catalyze sort of mentoring, angel investing, different entrepreneurship programming, you know, out there. So it was really about capacity building, bringing in these experts who have run these types of programs before, because there was nothing like that back five years ago. You know, Vietnam is obviously very different now, and the Swiss CP program has changed quite a bit since then, and is you know, and really trying to, I guess, further enhance the development. So and the other thing that I've really seen, especially over the last 2 or 3 years, is that local organizations want to develop their own ecosystems now. They don't want as much of the international support and expertise. I mean, so much of what you need to do is online, you know, and what I've seen is people need to take their own journeys. You know, I mean, me and Zoom have been working together for a long time, but there came a point where Zoom had to take his own journey and figure out how to do mentoring and other things. I mean, and I've seen that with other projects I've worked on. There's only so much knowledge as me as an American or a foreigner can provide. At some point, it's like swimming. You have to jump in the pool and you have to feel the buoyancy of the water to be able to understand how it works. I mean, when I talk about the magic of networking and connecting younger entrepreneurs with older entrepreneurs, you know, you understand what I'm saying, but until you actually implement it and connect people and facilitate discussions, do you really see the magic and understand how it works? So, you know, I think there's only so much that we can do as outsiders. It's really a lot of the programs that I've started, at some point, the people who run them have to have their own journey. They have to, you can tell them, I mean, it's like a child, you can, or a teenager, you can only tell them so much. At some point, they have to run and go and make their own mistakes and learn from those mistakes, you know, from that perspective. So, and I see that happening all over the world. I see, you know, so many of the countries that people are not only taking in what's sort of becoming international best practice and having dialogues through social media like Twitter and Facebook about these topics, but they're also developing their own thinking and, things. As I mentioned, the Tunisia Startup Act is considered one of the most successful pilots, out there from a lot of countries I've talked to. So, I see a lot more emerging markets sort of taking their own path instead of following others out there. Hopefully I answered your question.
Yes, I want to go into more details. You said that in Egypt, when you first start, people don't actually care much about entrepreneurship. So how can you get people to come together to join your project? From the government or from the accelerator or from the only one VC in Egypt? Because in Vietnam right now, I can see a situation when bank as well as big corporations, they don't have much interest. So how can you get them to join in your project?
Yeah, I mean, what I've seen the best is storytelling. You have to tell the story of local entrepreneurs being successful. I think what people want to see and they want to be able to relate to people. They want to, young people want to see entrepreneurs that they can relate to. They can't relate to Mark Zuckerberg. They need to see a local entrepreneur, succeed that comes from a similar circumstance as them. And so you have to find these stories. And again, it's not the business story, it's the human story of how they come from a specific town, how they didn't go to the best school, how they didn't have any money, how they gone through all these struggles, and they came out successfully because they did this and this and this. They had this successful business person that helped them. For me, it's about storytelling. I mean, if you look around the world, there's like 7 or 8 entrepreneurs everyone follows and they know their stories, and so finding that story in the Vietnamese context or within the rural context, depending on what provinces you work in, is critical. And getting those stories told through media outlets that your mom and dad and your grandparents listen to. Like I said, in Egypt, we did it through a good morning show, which wasn't a business show. It was, literally people are already at work. These are the mothers and the people staying at home, watching this show. And it's really just constant storytelling, reinforcing about what you're doing. I think what the mistakes are, people focus on branding too much, trying to make themselves look innovative and cool, and to me, this is all about storytelling, and making sure you really capture the essence of a person, their struggles, and making sure that it's relatable to other people that you're trying to affect. And again, if you're trying to affect a bigger culture, it might be talking about how their parents reacted, how their grandparents reacted, how they dealt with that. To me, these are the critical things, and then getting it out in the media, out there. That's what I've seen most successful. The best programs don't talk about themselves. They talk about the entrepreneurs they're helping. The entrepreneurs are their brand. If you look at Estonia, everybody talks about Skype. There's every country has their entrepreneur, and so, you have to understand, creating the story about these people and adjusting the story depending on who you're trying to influence is what I've seen the most, and it has to be consistent, and again, the more, when I talked about common purpose in the beginning, when you're running a for example, there's, I was just talking to Daniel Eisenberg, who created one of those ecosystem maps. He's out of Babson College. And we were talking about his focus is on going to old industrial cities. He's going to old industrial cities in Colombia and remaking them into entrepreneur cities. And what he does is he gets everyone on the common purpose of growth. He's like, we just want SMEs that grow. That's our focus. So all the storytelling is about growing. How do we help companies grow? And so, you know, first you do the programming, and of course, not every program creates all the successes, but you take your successes, you create stories about those successes, and you feed it to the broader network in society out there, and everything is about how you create revenue growth within these companies, how these companies are different than the old companies before them. And with that, he gets more and more organizations, universities, foundations, corporations helping him in his program focused on growth. He has one common purpose: to create companies that grow. And companies grow, create economic opportunity. And so that's his storyline, and he reinforces it through the stories of the entrepreneurs and what they're doing out there. So, you know, that's just one example out there, you know, but I think organizations I think they're disappointed when they talk about what they're doing. They communicate too much about what they're doing, or they communicate too much about their branding. They need to be focusing on who are the entrepreneurs, who are the mentors that are supporting us, you know, what is this community that is coming together? And when the community is all being looked at as the hero, then it just like really expands what everybody's thinking. I see there's some questions on the chat. Please elaborate more on what is the balance between direct and indirect support to the entrepreneurs. I think what we're learning, especially for accelerators and other types of entrepreneur support programs, and again, a lot of this data is in the GALI initiative, GALI. If you Google it, it has a lot of great data on how accelerators help entrepreneurs. But what we learned is that you can over-program an accelerator. Like you can have, you know, 5 days of training. You can have, you know, nightly workshops, practice pitch events, all these networking events. And you're not giving the room for the company to actually implement what it needs to do to grow. And so there's a real balance of the types of support you need to give to the entrepreneurs. And again, the entrepreneurs themselves benefit the most from the network. It's the most important thing out there. So what I've seen, for example, I volunteer and mentor at this accelerator near me up in Baltimore. And Deb, who runs that program, calls herself like it's an emergency room operation. You know, every company is different. Every company needs its own support. And so she's very demand driven, you know, so she doesn't try to have sort of generic training for every entrepreneur. She has webinars and other things that they can get if they want it. But she doesn't demand the entrepreneurs go through anything specific. She was there to specifically support their needs. And so when they need connections, if they need a connection to a certain company, or if they're having issues with personnel or agreements, you know, she tries to really be almost like that, you know, that emergency room nurse, like triaging the situation. Like, you know, they have a broken leg. This is the type of support I'm going to get them, you know. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs want that. They don't. I think there are some generic things you can offer them, but what I've seen is they want, if you're going to provide training, they want training that they can sort of learn on their own. You don't have to always make it in classroom. And again, a lot of the great programs I'm seeing out there, you know, they'll just record lots of webinars and the entrepreneurs just take as they need it. You know, they don't want to waste their time in a classroom. They really want to be connected. They want to meet interesting people who can help them within their industry or not. And I think the best programs I've seen just always have interesting people that the entrepreneurs can connect with. They have in the networks, And that's why a lot of the programs, if they're industry based, it helps them a lot because it helps them build a network around that industry. Not every country can do that because you can't get enough entrepreneurs in a specific industry, but the ones that are more industry based or technology based, it's easier for them to build their network specifically around that industry. For example, those that just work on apps will build relationships with all the telecom providers in those countries because those are critical connections. Other questions I saw. In your experience of building the ecosystem in Egypt, it was with the business champions. What was the role of government in Egypt? As I mentioned, the Egyptian government has always, been fairly tough and centralized, throughout the thousands of years of the country's history since the times of the pharaohs. It hasn't really changed since the revolution, unfortunately. And so the government's role is actually morphed a little bit. When I was there up to 2014, what we try to do is we try to create successful programs and then invite the government to participate. Because it was the NGOs and the entrepreneurship organizations that could do it really well, and then the government participated as sometimes financially supporting, sometimes just providing their own infrastructure, helping with sort of the political connections and things like that. But later, the government in Egypt has, it's complicated like every government. They have tried to do their own activities and programming, but more recently I've seen they partnered with different organizations within the ecosystem to implement, which I think is a much better model for them more recently. And they have, I think, also recently partnered with the Global Entrepreneurship Network, so they want those international connections. I think they've supported, they have a big event that is run by a young technology guy that they've supported to sort of make all the international connections. So they've become more of a facilitator. I think the point they struggle in is actually because it's such a centralized government, they struggle with getting these programs and the support outside of Cairo. So most of the successful entrepreneurs from other cities, for example, Alexandria, which is a city of 7 million people, they'll have to go to Cairo if they want that support. So many of the entrepreneurs that I know in Cairo were actually started in Alexandria, but because they couldn't get the support, they moved to Cairo. Was there other questions? No. Is there more questions?
The Zoom has one more, that is like in Vietnam we seem to start with more ideas. The Zoom has one more question that you haven't answered yet.
So I have another question. So Mai, you understand Vietnam quite well. So we start with not kind of business champion to build the ecosystem. We start with more like pioneer. So people who learn about the concept, who observe the ecosystem in the other countries, enthusiasm about that, and want to do something for Vietnam. So how and what also we learned that we need more champions to go back to the ecosystem. Then the question is, how should we do to bring more business champions into the ecosystem?
Yeah, it's literally making them feel accountable and responsible, to help the next generation of business people. Inviting them to tell their story, inviting them into small group meetings to talk to a small handful of young startups, founders, to have more, not just to talk, but they can have a conversation, you know, thanking them, putting them on stages. One of the things we did in Egypt is we had something, oh, you do this in Vietnam, I'm not going to talk about it, the Mentor Awards. But in Egypt, what we did is we took 50, we just took 50 mentors and we put them on stage, and we ran an event like the Oscars and had the ministers and others thank their hands, and we had a nice plaque for them. You know, it's really just showing the appreciation of them. And then you try to put them in the governance so they really feel like their decisions and their recommendations are heard, and they, you know, are respected. You know, you can create positions where they're a fellow or a, you know, some word that gives them great respect, you know, within an ecosystem sort of organization, you know, around that. You know, but I haven't found in too many countries that, you know, business people don't want to help, you know, young entrepreneurs. But again, I you know, you don't want to waste their time. They, you know, when they come and mentor and do other things, it has to be very efficient. They have, you know, you know, and the nice thing about COVID is that everybody's getting used to doing things virtually now. So there's ways to prevent, there's ways not to, you know, to take people's time just virtually, phone calls and events like this and webinars. But, you know, we made I mean, literally, I went out one-on-one to meet with people in the business community, not asking them how they can help me, but how I can help them help entrepreneurs. You know, what are their ideas? How, you know, what can we do together? You know, getting them on the stage, making sure they're their heroes. You know, it's, you know, that's what, you know, I saw. And, you know, and of course, and there's literally, you just need like 5 people. You know, literally, I could look at the Egyptian ecosystem, or the Cairo ecosystem, I should say, and there's 5 people that are totally influencing it, who've really put, you know, real effort and, you know, have really put their life into it, you know. But, you know, it's really just going out there and just individually just trying to make people accountable. And if you can get one person to do it, one successful business person, they can get a second person. They can be your ambassador to get the second. But, you know, again, you know, the data shows, I mean, it's great to have volunteers. It's great to have professors and consultants and others do this type of work. It's helpful, but you really need the business community who has connections to the markets, to financing, to so many other resources to get engaged to. And then, like I said, the data shows that if you do, then you'll have more success. I don't know if that answers the question. Maybe one of the last things I could bring, just because I know it's very Vietnam specific, it's just the work in the provinces. I mean, it's very difficult. Obviously, you have Ho Chi Minh, you have Hanoi, a little bit of Da Nang is doing some things, but the provinces is difficult. You know, how do you get, the difficulty is if you have a young person who really wants to do something innovative, they don't have the network in the Delta. So ultimately, they're going to go to Ho Chi Minh. And I know it sometimes frustrates provincial leaders probably, you know, I'm losing people, you know. And I personally, I think the best I've seen is you have to create sort of a hub and spoke system where you use the cities like Ho Chi Minh, and you bring in the entrepreneurs and the successful business people from Ho Chi Minh or Hanoi into the provinces, make connections and relationships, and then start to do things virtually. You know, that's what I've seen to help support. So I think, again, COVID has, I think, created more opportunities because we're learning not to be geographically stuck into one place. I mean, we're doing these things much more virtually. It's becoming more culturally acceptable. You know, everybody loves in-person connections, but you know, you actually might have an opportunity to do more sort of activities and programming in the rural provincial areas, because it doesn't matter what country. I've met young people that are learning all these cool and interesting things on the internet. They're so excited. They talk to the adults in their community, and the adults don't get them. Their minds are just thinking about all these creative things, and they're like building all this interesting stuff. And if you have an agribusiness, the agribusiness person doesn't get this kid who's just technology savvy, who's going to build something. And so I think it's important to find those innovators and connect them with the people in the big cities who can relate to them. Creating champions and finding champions in the cities, not just to help the city entrepreneurs, but to get out in the provinces is what I've seen pretty successful. And again, you can program that so, you know, you can use competitions, you can use other things to give both the mentors who help and the entrepreneurs sort of respect and press around these sort of activities.
So I think the hub and spoke model is something that F44 program and KNST are trying to build right now.
Okay. Yeah.
I have one question for you, Mike.
Yes.
Can you hear me clearly enough? You said that we should keep entrepreneurs accountable by building peer network or mentor network. So I don't really understand about peer network. So can you explain to me how we can build peer network and how we as a government can boost efficiency of the peer networks in our ecosystem?
I mean, so the accelerators do this very well through a cohort. So they'll have 6 companies or 8 companies, you know, run through a program over 3 months together. And there's always this collaborative nature of that. And I think if you do something like that, there's a check-in that happens every week or every other week where all the entrepreneurs are there, you know. And so, and what I've seen is that if you actually if you have a cohort of 6 companies and you have part of the review of that with the cohorts providing their own feedback to their colleagues that's sort of it's a peer review. That's sort of what one of the programs that's been sort of very successful. But you can create, you know, if it isn't startups, you know, you could create sort of an entrepreneurship group. There's some international ones like the Young Entrepreneurship Organization, YPO, like Young Presidents Organization, EO, the Entrepreneurship Organization, and they have like monthly sort of meetings. But the point is, if you can get a group together and have them meet on a reoccurring basis and have them sort of check in with each other, you know, and, you know, through a process, and sometimes that check-in could even be sort of you know, the more formal programs have check-ins actually on just their KPIs or indicators. It keeps that accountability. So in the mentoring, as Zoom knows, you know, I'm always a big advocate of, you know, the mentor should meet with the entrepreneur on a reoccurring basis and do check-ins on their KPIs and on their short-term KPIs, not their long-term KPIs. So on a quarterly basis, if they say they're going to, you know, build up, if they're going to meet with 100 customers next quarter, that mentor checks in and said, well, did you meet with 100 customers? You know, again, it's not that they're their boss, but it's a social network that kind of keeps them accountable. And especially a lot of this, it's around trust. So if you're with a bunch of people that you respect and trust and want to impress, and so again, that could be a peer network, that could be a mentor network, and you have that network sort of checking in on the entrepreneur on a reoccurring basis. So I used to say you can only do this through mentoring, but I've learned now that you can also do it through peer networks. And a lot of it, there's some accelerators who do this, where they basically, you know, on a weekly basis, you know, everyone has to present what have they done in the last week, you know, how much they gone. And some programs will actually have their peers almost do like a survivor game, like they'll vote off people from the program, like on a monthly basis, or, you know, so they'll actually, you have to impress your peers because they can actually vote you off the program. But I think the biggest thing is you connect with these people, you feel obligated to these people. You don't want to, you know, you want these people to, you know, feel like you're doing what they're doing. And if you, and I've seen it where the accelerators sort of create this culture where, you know, where they tell the entrepreneurs for the next 4 months, you know, kiss your girlfriend, boyfriend, goodbye, tell your mom and dad, we're not, you know, I'm going to see you in 4 months. I'm just going to focus into my business for this. And they create this culture, and then they have the companies reinforce that culture where they'll be Facebooking or tweeting, hey, I'm up at 6 a.m. working on, or 5 a.m. or whatever, working on my company. You know, it's both a culture thing and, you know, a networking thing, you know, within these organizations. And again, that's why I think the thing, you know, we have to realize about, you know, building companies, it's really, really hard. It isn't just about what to do. There's so much information of what to do. I mean, I'm sure in Vietnamese, there's a version of Lean Startup. I'm sure of it, you know, I'm sure a lot of the materials out there on the internet in Vietnamese. It's really, how do you get people to do hard things? How do you get entrepreneurs to be more aggressive out there, you know, as an Olympic athlete, you know? And so part of it, one of the ways to do it is through a peer network or getting them engaged with a mentor who they really, really respect, really want to impress, and really do not want to disappoint. So they will do the things that they say they will do. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah. So how about ecosystem governance? How about government should play a role as government should be in charge of governance, or other stakeholders should do that role?
You know, as I was trying to point out in my last slide, is no one should control the ecosystem. You know, again, it's as just like a rainforest. Nobody controls it. There's just these reinforcing actors that sort of keep each other accountable, you know, and there's, you know, and so, and support each other, you know, as far as that some animals eat from the plants and they grow. You have to realize that as the government, and I personally, I think if a government even provides, I mean, these are some of the things that I think I've seen other governments do that, you know, and I won't name names, but I've seen some governments basically promote their own program is to the international market. They brought in some people from Silicon Valley, and you know, and they do a lot of recruiting. They put a lot of resources, a lot of financial resources into it, and that's great. And they've had some successful entrepreneurs, but you don't see any other ecosystem organization in that country. They've all been sort of drowned out by this government. Really, it's put hundreds of millions of dollars into doing its own programming, you know. And so, you know, even if you look at venture capital, it has the biggest venture capital fund. the government does. There's not a private fund out there. And so if the government gets too big, its elbows get out, and it prevents the growth of other organizations from trying to do something. And even the way it could spend money sometimes, you know, if it's too specific, it influences how other ecosystem actors are. So, you know, I think the government has a great, you know, it's a great facilitator. It can bring organizations together to find common purpose. It can say, we want to accomplish this. I need you, private sector, and you, university, to help us. What can you do? I've seen, you know, like, I think the UK and others have done a lot of these challenge grants. So instead of being very explicit, like, this is what we want you to do, you're very, you know, more objective focused and say, we have some money, and whoever can, you know, grow 50 companies, 50%, will get this money. Like, we're really more objective focused. You know, we have challenge grants, and basically those that can prove it, we have like a pilot grant. You have a small pilot, you ask these organizations, go and grow companies by 50% over 6 months. And the ones that do have a bigger pot of money they can get to. So these are like challenge grants that other governments are doing. You know, in Jordan right now, basically the government is told the ecosystem, organize yourselves and tell us what you want. You know, first we want you to organize yourselves, show us that you're inclusive. It's not part of one group, you know, political group or tribal group, and tell us what you want. You know, so you know, but I think there's a lot of interesting things out there. But to me, again, the biggest thing is listen to your entrepreneurs, listen to the organizations that are trying to help entrepreneurs, listen to their ideas, experiment with those. Because there's no, again, in the United States, we don't have any, at the national level, there's really not much going on supporting an ecosystem or an entrepreneur. I think the biggest thing that happens is, the Small Business Administration, which is really working on two things. One is government procurement to ensure that I think 10 to 15% of all government businesses go to a small business and other minorities. And then, two is they have some subsidized funding, but most of the things are not, that happen in America are because of, the entrepreneurs in the local ecosystem out there. And there's more going on at the local governments in America than there is at the national government. Those are the things I think you could do to help. I know the Vietnam at the very highest levels of government, a lot of the government leaders have stated that it's important. Was it 1 year, the year of startup? And so I think that's great. They show that it's important to the government agenda, that entrepreneurs are important. But now I think it's really, I think, I'm sure you guys have listened to a lot of what a lot of different countries have done. But to me, it's really important to understand what the entrepreneurs in your community want, what the ecosystem wants. And again, I don't think, to me, you start off the relationship with doing something small that will be successful. Like you might go to some private sector organizations and say, let's do something together. Let's do something small that can help entrepreneurs that we know can be successful. And then we talk about it and storytell that story out there. It could be around mentoring. It could be around financing. It could be about women entrepreneurs. Again, that's that common purpose I talked about. Let's finding something that everyone gets excited about. Because I think one of the important things when I talk about entrepreneurship, a lot of people view it differently, and that's okay. you know, because as the government, you have so many needs out there. You're worried about micro enterprises. You're worried about, you know, the agriculture and the farmers and the agribusinesses. You want the innovative, tech-focused, disruptive technology startups. You know, you want to make sure you're inclusive to minorities and women. I mean, all these objectives are good. But the question is, can you start on a couple of those? One, where are people excited about, you know, right now? In America, just because of what's going on, everyone's focused in on minorities, you know, for good reason. You know, so there's a large focus on how we can get more African Americans and more women into business, you know, and so you see corporations getting on board. You see, you know, every American entrepreneur saying, I'm ready to mentor a woman entrepreneur or an African American entrepreneur. I mean, there's common purpose because of what's happening in society in our country right now. So partly what I'm saying is the reason I show those maps is those maps make, I think, everything so complicated. They're sort of like competitiveness maps. There's 100 things on your agenda if you use one of those maps. And if you reverse that map and you just say, let's just find where we can get people excited that they'll put their own resources into, where we can get the private sector to say, yes, we'll support something. And you start off doing something there, you build trust and momentum, you know, and then you tell that story of what happened, you know, the success that comes out of it. And that creates your momentum to go to the next level, the next level, and the next level. Because this takes so much time and this is such a journey, and you need all these stakeholders together in the journey. Like we talked about the private sector and the champions and others, that getting them in on a specific subject that they care about means a lot. You know, so, you know, it might be just like, let's focus in on startups that can help with COVID issues, you know, has been happened out there. How can we get the private sector helping us on that? But taking those first couple of steps builds sort of relationships, trust, and ability to collaborate that usually leads to other sort of possibilities out there. You know, so that's, you know, that's what I've seen, you know, government, you know, partners and, you know, organizations to do. You know, it's really to facilitate. The more you seem as a neutral actor, the more you're not trying to drive an agenda. And I know that's not, obviously every government has an agenda. But if you're really listening and trying to bring I mean, again, if you just bring in stakeholders from the ecosystem and just say, what do you think is the most important thing that we focus in on today? And what could we do easy, you know, that many resources that could really make an impact? What would that do? And you start off something small and short and powerful, that creates momentum for other things that, you know, so that, you know, I think that's some ideas, because I think a lot of governments are trying to do, like they do everything, a competitiveness. Like I know you have a competitiveness index and there's, you know, lots of categories and you see where you're weak and you focus in on those 10 things. You know, I think for this, because you want so many stakeholders together, that just focusing on one or two things that are important for everyone will create the momentum you need out there.
One last question. You talk about storytelling as a like
Sure.
to involve all the stakeholder in the ecosystem. Then I want to ask if there is a role of journalists in this situation. Should we change them, or we should focus on the entrepreneurs themselves to share their story within the network, or we should train the journalists to help them tell story on the media? What do you think about this?
I don't know if I caught all your question, but I think you said, you know, what are the roles of journalists in the ecosystem? I mean, they're so critical. It's, I mean, and especially the storytelling part. It motivates. I mean, for me, a lot of the ecosystem development is about mindset changing, really getting companies and society thinking that entrepreneurship and startups is important. And obviously having journalists or people who can write stories that have passion about it. I mean, real storytelling, not just your business article where people are talking about, did you make your quarterly numbers or not? I mean, really, again, capturing the thing about entrepreneurship that difference in your business story is there's so much drama. It's like a movie. It really feels, it's so personal. It's so much about the person than just the company. And so, you know, helping journalists, getting journalists access to entrepreneurs, facilitating that dialogue, getting them in the different sort of media outlets, and again, the different channels depending on who you're targeting and who you're trying to change, you know, is important. But always, you know, just again, I think the big thing for Egypt is when we started to get stories out about, you know, young Egyptians doing something differently, thinking differently, you know, not even caring about business, but caring about solving problems. And writing those stories, I think really helped change the momentum of what the perception of what an entrepreneur is out there.
Okay, I have one more question. I think one more question before we finish.
Okay.
You said that the role of the like local government is like so important in this stage. So I want to ask, how can the like internal network in some like province connect with regions and then go global, and what can the national government do to facilitate this?
Okay. So the question was, what can the national government do to facilitate international relationships and connections?
Some internal network in the province because they are small and then they don't have like the branding of the government, so that sometimes it's hard for them to connect with some regional network or like some like global network. So how is this in the like in your experience? How can the internal network connect with like some regional and global network, and at our role at the national government, what can we do to facilitate it?
Yeah, I mean, that's I mean, you know, for a big country like Vietnam, you know, it's good to think decentralized way. I know in America during Obama's administration, we had something called the Startup Act, or the what was that called? I mean, he facilitated some private large businesses or successful entrepreneurs to focus in on what America calls the flyover. You know, we have our the two coasts, and we're so populated on the two coasts, and then everything in the middle is you know, not as important. You know, we call that the flyover. You fly from New York to LA or New York to San Francisco, and all the rest of America, nobody pays attention to. And so as I remember, Obama would actually ask some entrepreneurs, let's focus in on helping the flyover states, more rural areas, you know, not as populated areas. He convinced some of them to actually create a fund, a venture capital fund for that. And they actually had a moving, like I think they rented a bus and they would visit some of these places with some successful businesses, and they would highlight, they would get people excited in those places to meet these national entrepreneurs, but at the same time, they would capture stories from these provinces to tell that there are local provinces to help, you know, there are local entrepreneurs within these, you know, our states, your provinces, that are in these more unknown places, you know, and I think that was part of it too. The other thing they did is they had a resources, a pot of money that other local organizations could ask for to help build their ecosystem. You know, and I think the national government just had an agenda of this is what we wanted to accomplish, and you tell us how you're going to do that, and you can get some financial resources to help build up your local ecosystem, because it's very difficult at, you know, especially in big countries like Vietnam or big countries like the United States, to do something locally at the national level. Very difficult. You have to rely on local institutions to do that. And so that's what they did in the States. As I mentioned before, my experience in Egypt is they failed because they're so centralized. You know, it's very difficult for the central government not to, I mean, they're following what, I mean, the provinces follow what the state wants them to do. So they don't have a lot of autonomy to think about things differently. And so, you know, but giving these other stakeholders, you know, their own ability to make, they're giving stakeholders at the provincial level their own sort of ability to come up with their own plans, to ask for resources is you know, something that has been, you know, tried and successful, you know, out there. But, you know, but it is a similar issue to a lot of, I will say a lot of countries, even the United States, are struggling. How do we develop really robust ecosystems outside of our major business hubs? You know, it isn't just, you know, it isn't just a Vietnam issue. It's definitely in other parts, you know, how can we make this dynamic business center? How can we make these other cities internationally connected? You know, so it isn't just Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi, you know, because those international connections are important. And I think there's one question about international, you know, how are countries and ecosystems making sure that other entrepreneurship sort of activities are, you know, saying Vietnam is great. You know, I think one thing is when you talk to your embassies, so all the local embassies that are in Vietnam, the Americans, the British, I think it's important if they ever bring in entrepreneurship delegations that you coordinate so you can bring them out into the rural areas and other places. Because I mean, I've seen it. Every country wants to highlight their entrepreneurship way of life. They want to highlight the way they do entrepreneurship. You know, the Australians, the Swedes, the Swiss, and so, and I'm sure you've seen every country want to be able to influence you. So, you know, making sure that they feel welcome and telling them that you want. When they bring in delegations, when they bring in experts, that you just don't want them in Ho Chi Minh or Hanoi, you want them down into the regions, you want to create more international connections. Maybe you're looking to actually to create you know, connections between cities, sister cities, you know, around this. I think that is very helpful. Same with the international media. You know, when you have big events, to make sure that they come to those events. I know you guys have Tech Fest, I believe, but making sure TechCrunch. I mean, besides the regional media like Tech in Asia, but inviting all the international media there, giving them a spot to talk about what their lessons are. I mean, I've seen TechCrunch have bring in speakers before. But I mean, to bring in influential bloggers, social media people, I mean, those types of things really help build up your reputation and get more international people excited about what you're doing in the country.
Okay. So yeah, I think that is. Thank you so much for the sharing session with us today. I really appreciate it. And then we some of the information provided today is a little bit hard for us to understand and a little bit hard for us to digest right now. So I think I do have to record, so I think we have to like listen again for like 1 or 2 more times before we finally understand it. The government and then like the peer review and the peer like network and then like something like that. It is actually quite hard for us to understand right now.
I'm sorry. Can you say that again? What was hard to understand?
Oh, what? No, I just like wrap up the whole like because it takes time for us to like understand all the things that you just provide like and
Okay.
for us to like to research more like about your case in Egypt. We will look into that and then we will see if we can find like some like lessons for us like, in how to like connect and how to get people that is not easily like involved in the entrepreneurship, just to make them to have them to convince them to like come and then they join to have the entrepreneurs in Vietnam. So yes, thank you for joining us today. So thank you Mr. Zoom for like connecting us with Mike.
Welcome.
I mean, I do anything for Zoom, so whatever he asks me to do, I always do it.
Go to Vietnam now, next week.
I wish.
I will buy you some beer.
There's no plane right. There's no planes.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. And thank you guys from 844 program.
Bye now.
Bye bye.